It rarely ever crosses our mind because it is perhaps one of the most terrifying things any human could ever experience. And if it happened to you, would your mind be sent reeling and after a frantic surge of energy and clawing just give up and quit? Or do you think you could hold your nerves together long enough to figure out a plan of escape like these people did? Here's 5 insane stories from people being buried alive. Number 5, the bodybuilder. Stacy Gam was looking forward to marrying her longtime boyfriend, Keith Hughes. But over the years, her mind had been corrupted, and their relationship was quite chaotic, to say the least. She eventually confused his aggressive behavior for love. To give you an idea of what we're talking about, Hughes was a bodybuilder had once been jailed in 2013 for close to 4 years on 3 separate aggravated assault charges against William. He was also charged for false imprisonment, holding Stacy against her will. It wasn't entirely revealed what happened between the two for these charges to occur, but still, she loved him, and so, a few years after he served out his sentence and was released, the couple rekindled their relationship. In July of 2016, Hughes then asked for her hand in marriage, and she accepted. Just a few days later, the two went for a stroll, and like what had happened many times before, an argument erupted between them. Stacy had accused her groom-to-be of stealing money from her. She then made a fatal mistake and threatened to have him sent back to prison if he didn't pay her back. Things spiraled out of control quickly after that, and the two started shouting, and that's when Hughes grabbed her by the neck and held on tight until she lost consciousness. Realizing he had killed her, he dragged her body off to a secluded wooded area. He dug a shallow grave, tossed her in, and then threw the dirt back on and then a large pile of tree branches for good measure. After that, he left her there and he walked home. But Stacy was still alive. It took some time, but she eventually regained consciousness, yet she was still in the pitch black. She could hardly move, and realizing that she was trapped and buried, and though she knew she was still near the Swansea Bay area, as she could hear the sound of the sea in the background. And she was having difficulties breathing and even moving her body. Everything seemed to slow down as she gradually came to her senses. In a later interview, she would go on to state, "It was like everything was in slow motion. All I could see were blurs of green and brown. It was like I was paralyzed. It was awful, really." And despite her lack of strength in her body, Stacy continued to try to push her way out little by little. Thankfully, she managed to emerge from the ground. She crawled to a nearby golf club, where she found help and rescue. But Stacy was in really rough shape. When she was taken to a hospital, they put her in an induced coma for 26 days in order for her to fully recover. Hughes tried to evade the cops, and he stole Stacy's car and crashed. That's when they grabbed him. He told the authorities they'd never find her body, and that's when he was informed that they already had, and that she was still alive to tell the tale. And for that, he was sentenced to life in prison. Stacy made a full recovery and got her life back together, despite the occasional flashbacks and panic attacks. She tried to move on from the whole ordeal. Unfortunately, though, after falling ill with pneumonia in 2022, at the age of 40, Stacy passed away. Number 4, a brother's sinister game. On a spring evening in April of 2020, in the small village of Mariansk in Ukraine, 57-year-old Nina Rudchenko was inside her house when 2 local thugs suddenly broke inside. And they were brothers, and the 27 and 30-year-old attacked Nina without hesitation and punched her in the face several times and went at her body with blows from a baseball bat. For no known reason, this went on for more than 2 hours, until finally Nina passed out from the pain. The men weren't finished, though. They drove her to a cemetery, dragged her in there among the gravestones. and they needed her to do something for them, so they poured water on her face until she came to, and that's when they made her dig a grave. It was her own, and she knew it. While pushing up the dirt, she pleaded with them, but it was like they had orders, and nothing she could say was going to change their minds. When it was time, they pushed her in, and as they began piling the dirt on her, the only thing she could think of was to turn over on her stomach and cover her face with her hands. At least that way, she could reserve a small pocket of air. In a later interview with the police, she said that she laid in her grave face down as her tormentors began to bury her alive. The men were laughing, talking about plans to get rid of her entire family. After she was covered completely, the two then fled the scene. And they assumed she was dead, but they didn't realize that Nina was such a fighter and wasn't going to be taken out so easily. With a concussion, broken jaw, and nose, she could barely catch her breath. She managed to turn herself around enough where she could begin moving the dirt, and over the course of about an hour, she clawed her way out. Once out in the open air, the adrenaline died down. She passed out right there. Once she woke up, she then crawled her way back to her home before losing consciousness again, and this time from utter exhaustion. The following morning, her sister found her lying on the floor of her house. She was horrified to see Nina's face, covered with filth, bruises, and blood, and she could barely recognize her. At the hospital, Nina was eventually able to rest and have her wounds tended to. The local authorities would catch the two culprits based on the information Nina provided, and they claimed they were drunk at the time and just messing around. They're currently in jail, facing kidnapping and attempted murder charges for the sick and twisted attack on an innocent but very strong woman. Number 3, a simple plan. In 2005, 27-year-old Michalina Lewandowska and 25-year-old Marcin Kazbrick moved to the United Kingdom from Poland to seek better job opportunities and build their lives together. The two were inseparable. Not long after arriving, Marcin gave her a ring and asked her for her hand in marriage, and she couldn't have been happier. In 2008, the couple then gave birth to a son. While it should have been an amazing time in their lives, things were off. The stresses of it all were getting to Marcin, and from there, the relationship headed downhill fast. Marcin began seeing another woman, whom he ultimately decided he would rather be with. He was still engaged to Michalina, though, and couldn't afford to cut it off with her because he was afraid that she'd take his son away. And so, this is how it went on for some time between the two. A constant fighting. Marcin was miserable and yet couldn't just let go. He went on to talk with one of his buddies at the meat factory that he worked at about his situation. It was 18-year-old Patrick Bors. In turn, Patrick began telling him about a simple and very effective way to get rid of his problem. And in 2011, the two buddies decided to finally do it. In December of that year, Marcin one day snuck up behind his fiancée and gave her 2 shots to the neck with a taser that knocked her out cold. So step 1 was complete. Then Patrick, who was waiting nearby, helped bind and gag her before they stuffed her into a large cardboard computer box. From there, the box was taped shut, essentially becoming her coffin. The men loaded her into Marcin's car and then drove out to the woods alongside the outskirts of Huddersfield in West Yorkshire. And with no one around, just the deep, dark woods, they dug a grave and they threw the box in. They purposefully put her head down first and then placed a 90-pound tree branch on top of the box to impede any of her attempts to possibly escape, and they left her for dead. With all the blood rushing to her head, Michalina struggled to move in the enclosure, and her air was running thin. In this dire situation, she remembered the only possible tool she had on her, the engagement ring. And through the hardened diamond, she was able to cut her legs free from the binds. She went on to scratch at that tape and finally opened up the box. She estimated that it took around a half hour to cut herself free from the makeshift casket, at which point she was able to work her way around the tree branch and crawl up to the surface. And near the road, she was able to flag down a car. They then helped her get to safety. A manhunt was underway. Since they thought she was dead and weren't on the run, it didn't take long for the police to apprehend Marcine and Patrick. It turns out, after they buried her, the men took her debit card and withdrew a couple $100 from her account. After that, they headed to Patrick's place to have a little celebration, which was interrupted by the police knocking on the door. In his defense, Marcine said that he only wanted to scare his girlfriend, and that he had planned all along to come back and free her. And the prosecution and the jury thought otherwise, though. And he was sentenced to 20 years in prison on that same month that the incident occurred. And Patrick, on the other hand, was for some reason cleared of attempted murder charges. Number 2, the Undead. In the early days of medical science, like way back in the 1800s, sometimes it could be difficult to determine if someone was actually dead. And they had no surefire way of telling if a person was just in a coma, emaciated, paralyzed, or just plain unconscious. And such was the case of a woman from Brazil, Rosângela dos Santos. Only her story took place in 2018. Dos Santos was from Racheio das Neves, which is a small area located in the northeast region of Brazil. In January of 2018, she was rushed to a local hospital by her family after she became unresponsive. She had suffered a heart attack, it appeared, and for a week they kept her there, barely hanging on. On the 8th day, the doctors had to tell the family the bad news that Dos Santos had passed away. The death certificate issued indicated that she suffered from 2 cardiac arrests before ultimately dying from septic shock. A funeral was held for Dos Santos a few days later. As was the custom, she was buried in a concrete tomb at the municipal cemetery in her hometown just a day after that. And then something miraculous but also terrifying happened. 11 days following the burial, on February 9th, locals living near the cemetery reported hearing screams, banging, and groans coming from inside the tomb of the recently buried woman. Dos Santos' family was alerted right away. As soon as they arrived, they could hear Dos Santos too, though her screams didn't last long. They immediately got to work dismantling the concrete, but it wasn't easy. Videos and photos taken during the incident showed people furiously pulling the coffin out from the beaten-down enclosure. When they finally opened it up, it appeared as though it was too late. Over to everyone's surprise, and there were signs that she was actually alive in there. Testimonies from those present said they could feel warmth when they touched her feet. The injuries she incurred on her hands suggested that she had been trying to claw her way out from that casket. In the box itself, they found the nails that had been hammered in were loosened. And the incident was reported to the police, and then began an investigation on the matter. A representative of the hospital, meanwhile, said that they'll provide all the necessary information to the authorities and family. Unfortunately, though, Dos Santos wasn't able to make it out alive from her seemingly early grave, and so she was buried once again, a second time around. Number 1, back for revenge. Forrest Bowyer was a successful businessman down in Phoenix, Alabama. Nicknamed Butch around town, he owned a huge used car lot, was a solid salesman who had gotten a reputation in the area for always carrying around large stacks of cash in his pockets. After all, what's the point of making lots of money if you can't show it off? In February of 2002, 2 men who knew of Butch's tendencies, Michael Currath and Jimmy Brooks, rolled up to his lot. They claimed to be narcotics officers investigating a case involving his business. Butch claimed he had no idea what they were talking about, and that's when his 12-year-old son, Brett, came over to see what all the commotion was about. The men then forced the father and son at gunpoint into their vehicle. And they drove about 20 miles south of town, stopped in an area close to where U.S. Highway 431 was still being built. Looking around, it was barren and desolate, the implication being that if Butch didn't give them what they wanted, then him and his boy would be buried here, and no one would ever find them. And the kidnappers asked about a safe, which Butch told them he had at his home, and that it contained around $40,000 in cash. They all headed over there. Butch handed over the money with no problem and expected them to leave the two alone, but they didn't. And they put them back in the car and then drove right on back to the construction site. And they pulled Butch and his son out, walked them over to a previously dug grave. And they had Butch kneel in front of it, and they slashed his throat and dropped him in. Despite that cut running ear to ear, it wasn't deep enough, and so Butch just pretended to be dead. Lying motionless at the bottom, he then heard 3 gunshots from above, followed by Brett's body falling in the pit on top of him. After this, the killers covered the grave with dirt, and they left the scene. Butch was stuck underground for about 15 minutes before he began his ascent to the top. He also worked to unearth his deceased son. Despite bleeding heavily from his wound, Butch walked for almost a mile before being able to get help. A police unit happened to be nearby. They called an ambulance, but Butch wouldn't go with them until they recovered his son's body. The officers assured him that they would go to the spot to retrieve him, and only then did he agree to go on ahead to the hospital. And meanwhile, Butch provided the police a detailed description of the car driven by the perpetrators. And through this information, authorities were quickly able to apprehend Kurth and Brooks. And they were later charged for kidnapping, murder, and attempted murder. Both were sentenced to death in 2003, and they're now currently awaiting execution. So there were 5 insane stories from people being buried alive. Hope you all enjoyed this episode, and thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one.